Good morning to you, my beautiful, lovely, wealthy nation. I'm Adrian. Today we're going to be talking about populism. Populism, very hot topic of the day because it seems to pop up all over the place. What is populism? Is it an alt-right thing? Is it something about the far left? It seems to be used on both sides, seems to be everywhere, so it's kind of hard to define, understand what it is, because it almost contradicts itself when you just see the word around in the news. And populism does relate to movements that are both on the left and on the right. It's simply a political organization, a political ideology that there are corrupt elites in power, that the politicians in power are entrenched, corrupt establishment elites that are out there. As we'll listen to my coffee machine turn off. Right on time. So there are corrupt elites in power, and that's sort of the establishment. And the populist narrative is that there are people whose rightful duty it is to restore democratic representation in politics. And that's the populist idea. It is we the people versus they the elites. That's it. So it can be on the left, it can be on the right. Either way, we've seen both. The most recent successful example of a populist movement in the United States was the election of Donald Trump. He was a populist on the right, running an anti-neoliberal populist campaign, which is ironic because he, as a businessman, benefits greatly from neoliberal economic policies. But he ran his campaign as an alt-right populist. It's sort of the label that we put on him now. And we'll look at the populism more so than the alt-right, because alt-right carries a lot of negative connotations, deserved and undeserved. They really are an alternative to the right. Well, in any case, we're not talking about that. Hard not to think about that now, but let's cycle right back to populism, because that's what we're talking about. Populism exists on both the left and the right, so let's just dive into some examples, because Donald Trump is one of the more obvious, but he's definitely not the only example. We have in the United States Bernie Sanders on the left, who is a Democratic populist. Probably a big reason he did not win the nomination from the party is that the Democratic Party recognized he broke from sort of establishment norms, and they didn't like that, so they opted for the centrist, gray-haired old white man, Biden, instead. But Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are both examples of sort of populist leaders. Populist leader, just in the idea that, just in the sense that their narrative is that elite versus people narrative. There are entrenched elites that are not looking out for you. They're only looking out for their own interests. They're completely out of touch with the people. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have this narrative. The answer to solving that problem is very different depending on which side you're on, but they're both populist movements because of that idea that there is a mass of people who are unrepresented in the way that we govern. That's populism. So other examples from around the world, because it's not just the United States, there are the Brexiteers, the UK Independence Party, the UKIP, are an example of a populist movement on the political right. Over in England, colloquially known as the Brexiteers, Brexit was sort of a populist movement that's again rejected, in a lot of ways it rejected neoliberalism. What we're seeing today in populism is pretty much a rejection of neoliberalism. The idea that there's sort of a centralized body of control that has the ability to influence everything. And so Brexiteers didn't like the European Union, felt like that was a one-sided, not one-sided, but a mostly one-directional relationship, the same way the political right felt about all international relations. Here in the United States, we took the America First approach, similar to England and Brexit. But there's also people on the left. There's the Podemos party in Spain and the Syriza party in Greece. And I don't know if I'm saying those correctly or not, but they are a couple examples of global populist movements on the political left. And then, of course, back on the right, there's Marine Le Pen from the French National Rally, which was formerly the National Front. Another very much on the right, political right of politics. And frankly, today there are a lot more populist movements on the right, my right, your right, a lot more populist movements on the right than there are on the left. Why? That's a good question. I have some ideas, but we'll talk about that in other videos. I think that it has to do with the fact that most populist movements are a rejection to neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is the byproduct of sort of a concentration of wealth and power. So populist movements that reject neoliberalism come from people who have not benefited from neoliberalism, which happen to be working class, blue-collar people on the political right. Political right. That's my theory in short. There are many more populist movements on the political right than there are on the left. This is an incomplete list. If you want to go check out more, the source is right there at the bottom. But here's why I want to talk about populism in this context of unity, rather than how can we go about forming our populist movement. Because I think there's a lot of value in the populist description of the world. It is true in a lot of ways that there are people who are very out of touch with everyday people that exist up on the hill. They live in their own worlds in a lot of ways, and they are out of touch with mass of people. And so there is sort of this duality that exists between us and them, but I always think that us and them language is a slippery slope. It's dangerous, doesn't help us actually build anything, doesn't help us do anything constructive. Us and them only leads to more division. It's just a perpetuation of the idea that there are these objective good guys, bad guys, whatever it is. So I think that populism is a helpful idea to understand the power dynamic between those with power and those without power, because there is a difference in the amount of influence that a politician has versus an everyday person. So populism is helpful for that sort of language, to understand how power is distributed hierarchically in our society right now. I think it falls short in any sort of lasting movement to affect real change. I think that the narrative of us and them, it just allows us to continue our own sense of divide and conquer. We're dividing and conquering ourselves so that the political elites don't have to. I think that's where populism leads us. And to go back to our same spectrum that we graph for who's on each side, both of them have that same story. There are the establishment elites who are irredeemably corrupt, sitting right there in the middle. And I think that that narrative actually blinds us to our common interests. I understand it's extremely hard for people on the left to talk with people on the right, and vice versa, because we've just been exposed to so many different ideas. We've had, for a very long time, we've had this political divide widening. Since before my time, since the days, I think the earliest example that I heard concretely are the days of Newt Gingrich, who said, no matter what the Democrats do, we're stopping it. So it's just sort of it's just a partisan war for the sake of partisanship, which is dumb. But in any case, that's what's happening up on the Hill, and that's why we have so many government shutdowns. It's why we can't seem to get anything done. It's why so many news stories were about the very narrow Democratic majority that might have resulted from the Georgia runoff elections. just a narrow victory. That's all it took, because of the understanding that, wow, even if they just had the minority by one person, Democrats weren't going to get anything done whatsoever, because partisan politics for partisans' sake. That's ridiculous, but that is how our politics are organized right now. So again, I think that there's a lot of merit in this populist arguments that these establishment politicians are irredeemably corrupt, that the people need to restore an actual representative democracy. Because right now it's not very representative. But my issue with populism is, again, it leaves no room for nuance and supporting people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Stacey Abrams, who are trying to affect change from the inside. If we just lump everybody together, if you're in the Democratic Party in a position of power, you're a corrupt elite, that leaves no room for conversation to say, well, there are some people trying to affect change from the inside while we push from the outside to keep that going. We need to understand that there are multiple systems that interplay. It's not just that duality of us versus them. There's a lot more. And all of these systems, and I'm talking about social justice organizations, I'm talking about the political parties, I'm talking about lobbyist organizations for corporations, non-profit organizations, corporations themselves. All of these organizations, your school, your place of work, your church or synagogue or mosque, any place you have a sense of community, there are all of these systems that interplay with the dominant economic, political systems of power, so to speak. So to better understand how these work together and when there's actually value in the existing establishment form of government and when there's not, we need to take a more sophisticated approach. So rather than taking a populist approach, we advocate for a pluralist approach. Pluralism, by definition, just means that you recognize that there's a plurality of forces at play here. There aren't just two. It's not just elites and people, because that leaves a whole lot of room for debate for who are those people and who are those elites. And you can just throw anything into the bucket of an elite that you don't like. So, for example, the people who stormed the Capitol, for a very long time, Mike Pence was number 2 guy. He was perfectly fine in the eyes of fanatical Trump supporters. But as soon as he refused to overturn the results of the election just outright, he became a corrupt establishment elite. He was thrown in the bucket, thrown down the poisoned well of corrupt elites. So we spend all our time arguing who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, rather than actually trying to work towards a solution. So populism can kind of tire us out in that way. Again, it's a way to blind each other to our common interests. Pluralism, on the other hand, offers a path for unity. It's very difficult right now to bridge that political gap, to have a conversation with people who have been informed differently than you, because that's really what it is. But that's the important part, is to have those conversations, and you realize that we don't actually disagree. We've just been informed differently. That really is all that it is. If I believed the same thing that you believed, I'd be just as upset as you are. I'd be livid with whatever circumstance it is that you're also livid about, because that's just how it works. You're not wrong for feeling the way that you do. It's the association between whatever organization is the scapegoat and your feeling. That's what's wrong. There is an association there between Black Lives Matter and Antifa as a terrorist organization. That's not true. There's an association between all Trump supporters as just irredeemable racists. And that's also not true. We have to open our minds to the fact that these are people. We can relate with people. Generalizations are where we start to lose that sense of reality. We lose their real identity, and with it we lose any hope of connecting. And so we're always going to stay divided. I think that unfortunately populism only offers a path to more division. Because by definition, it's us versus them. And what happens, even if the us, the we, we're able to take the power, what happens then? If we were to succeed, we become the them. And there's a new us and a new them. And the cycle kind of repeats. So with populism, I don't ever see unity. I don't see an end to this division that is characteristic of our time right now. So pluralism as an approach, I think, is much better to appreciate where other people come from, appreciate the value of certain systems in certain contexts, and then we can start to build a more sophisticated approach for a better future. So that's been populism. Probably a pretty long one, but Monday thoughts for you. Hope you learned something. As you were, Wealthy Nation, with love.